You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Hey, welcome to I Am Refocused Radio, man. We are here once again, and today we have another show lined up for y'all. Today, man, we're going to be talking to an author, and this guy has an awesome story, man. He's coming from Columbus, Ohio, and man, he has an amazing book that we will talk about later in the show. I Made a Place for You. But man, he has a powerful story, a power story of overcoming and really just making things happen. So we're going to learn all about Damian right now. First and foremost, how you doing, sir? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing well. I'm super excited to be here. I think your platform is putting out great stories, and so I'm super excited to share mine.
Appreciate that, man. Yeah, it's all about stories. So, man, first and foremost, give our audience a little background of who is Damian White, and you as a writer, what inspired you to take that path?
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, as you mentioned. I spent 4 years right outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, attending Davidson College. Go Stephen Curry. Not sure if you're a Warriors fan or not, but naturally have to be for me. I recently published my first poetry book called I Made a Place for You. And I've loved writing most of my life. I would say like through the ups and downs, writing has been a safe outlet for me to kind of get it all out. And I've had some tough times. So having an avenue to make sense of my experiences, something that I've never taken for granted. I spent several months homeless, twice actually, one time in Florida and one time in California. And both times like really wreaked havoc on my sense of normalcy. I guess the best way I could describe it would be like when you're homeless, you don't have the same stories to tell or the same issues to complain about over dinner. You have to focus on survival and escape. And I think that those times taught me lessons that school never could about humility and humanity. And I think that like I had to ask myself, at what point do I end the blame game? When do the ifs and the buts run out? And when you realize that like at the end of that road, you're just stuck looking at yourself, you can often be the hardest person to face. And it made me realize why people get stuck, because that burden of guilt and not reaching everyone's expectations for you isn't a light one. And especially when you run out of people to point fingers at. So all of that kind of culminated into me finally putting pen to paper to write this book. I've been writing poetry since I was 4 years old, and I've done spoken word competitions and poetry slams and, you know, all of that. But there was just something that was holding me back from writing the book. And then the experiences being homeless were the catalyst for just kind of getting my fire back going, because I realized like I could possibly not make it long enough to see some of the bucket list items that I promised myself I would accomplish, see them through. And writing this book was one of them. So at the point when I came back home and I got back to kind of a regular routine, regular life, got back working and got back to a normal kind of like lifestyle, I really did focus on writing the book. So that's kind of what led me to I Made a Place for You.
And with your experience being homeless, I mean, kind of illustrate that part to the audience. I mean, what was going through your mind? How did you keep yourself from, saying, you know what, I can't do, anything, you know what I'm saying? Like, because the reason why I'm asked that is because I have a person in the family. I had a brother who was military. He was homeless. So I kind of, understand how crazy that feeling can be as far as someone in the family experiencing that. But you personally, man, how did you stay positive and just upbeat?
Yeah, and it's super interesting to think about how I felt about it then and also how I feel about it now. Then it was really actually freeing in a sense, because I was at both times I was escaping situations that I didn't want to be in, getting rid of having to be in circumstances with people I didn't want to see every day. And so I think that although I knew my life situation wasn't the best, I also felt a sense of chains breaking from getting out of those situations. So in one way, it was kind of like liberating in a sense. The other side of it though was it was very like difficult for my identity because I had built my identity on being the A plus 4.0 student in school. I went to the private school and then I went to the private college and I went to grad school even though I didn't finish, but like I still was doing the things that like I was walking the path that like I assumed I should be walking and like that I knew was up to par, I guess you'd say, for my family standards and friend standards and kind of just like the standards I had adopted for myself um, along the way. And I think that getting out of thinking like that, like no one cares what degree you have when everyone's at the shelter, right? Nobody's interested in what you studied or what your thesis was on when you're in the line to pick up clothes at at the Salvation Army. So for me, it's like the dialogue changed, the community changed, and like it's even interesting to say like I was part of a homeless community. I wasn't just out there living under a bridge by myself, not interacting with people. I was interacting with people. This is like part of the mystique and mystery of this experience for me was that I got so wrapped up in that environment that you kind of forget that that's not your real life. And there was a part of that. There were points in time where I wasn't so sure I wanted to come home. I wasn't so sure that I wasn't just comfortable making this my final resting place if that was what was to be, because I had already shed kind of like all of my past, and I had just accepted the fact that like this was my life now. I couldn't go back to the old places. I had embarrassed myself. I had burned the bridges. I had humiliated myself, right? In my mind. These are all the thoughts I'm having. But in real life, when you realize that like these people are not your friends. These people are they never were going to be. They're just also in a situation inside of the petri dish that they probably don't want to be in. And it just happens that no one else they don't have anything else to do either. So they're just out here hanging out at the park with you all day. And then you mistake that for like the same way that someone, comes and talks to you about your relationship after work or something, a coworker. And it's not the same. They're not the same. These are people that are surviving and feeding off each other and taking from each other and giving, it is a vibrant community. And I learned a lot from just being there because I've met people from walks of life that like, I don't know how I would have interacted with before. And it was just a lesson in humility that everyone has a story. So, it's not just like, I didn't just meet people who were just like lifelong criminals and they just never wanted to go to school. And I met people who were doctors and like they were on the public assistance and they were also eating at the shelter and they were also like, and they were former practicing physicians, right? Or practicing lawyers or teachers. And you just meet all these people and like, you never know who's who. And I think that like going through that, it just made me want to apply that to my life in general. So just everywhere I go, anytime I meet anyone, just shed the assumptions because the things that people might assume about me would be incorrect because the way I present myself would never be like someone that was picking up food out of a trash can at one point in time.
Man, yeah, that's so interesting how you say all those different people from different backgrounds, because there's unfortunately a bad stigma to homelessness. People assume, they're just lazy, all this bias, thinking. But to your point, is a lot of people who just went through a hard, difficult path, patch, if you will. Mm-hmm. But for you, at what point did you start seeing things turn around for yourself? Did you meet certain people? Was it like you just got up one day and said, okay, this is what I need to do in order to get out of this? At what point did you start seeing the opportunity for you to change your path?
It was really when I felt like my safety was in question. So part of getting super comfortable with people is that you let your guard down to walking down those streets that you might not have gone down before, or getting in those cars that you wouldn't have got in before. And I started to realize that like I was in places and situations that like I couldn't even believe that I was in. And there was just a day where a guy basically threatened me. I won't go into the whole story, but he threatened me, and I did feel that like I was gonna die here. Like I really did think that. I was like, I'm gonna die here if I don't figure something out. And at the time, my grandma was still alive, and she was always like kind of my guiding light. I always said like I had to go back home to see her if I was gonna go back home for anything. And so I think that those two thoughts, like my fight or flight response after the interaction I had with this guy on the street, and also just remembering that my grandma was at home, combined just flipped the switch for me where I just knew I had to do something. So it was crazy. I mean, I had thrown my phone away about like 2.5 months prior to this. I didn't have a phone for that long, and I had to find a way to get home. So I had heard about this project where if you went to the San Francisco, one of the offices downtown, then they would call someone from your hometown, and if they would receive you, then they would put you on the Greyhound bus for free. So I ended up calling my grandma, and like she said, obviously she'd pick me up from the Greyhound station. So San Francisco City bought my Greyhound, and I was on the Greyhound for like 25 hours from San Francisco to Columbus, Ohio. And it was the most miserable trip of all time. But it was my long haul home, and it's just a time I'll never forget that I learned an incredible amount about myself and about the world. And I wouldn't sit here and tell you that it was all bad. And I wouldn't sit here and tell you that I was all roses either. But I would say that I can't imagine who I'd be or who I'd be becoming if I hadn't had those experiences.
Listen to Refocus Radio, talking to our guest today, Damian White. And yeah, man, we touched on earlier in the interview, you being a writer, but specifically you got into poetry, and in a way that was another tool for you. So explain for the audience, was that a way for you to kind of release the stress and kind of start the healing process, or was it just something that you always utilize?
Yeah, it was something I always utilized. I had always poured my feelings and thoughts into poetry. It just happens that this book was mostly geared towards getting out some of the thoughts and questions I had from my experience being homeless. So there's a lot of like spiritual questions and self-identity questions and growth questions, and just like there was a lot of maturing that happened and kind of like unpeeling like an onion, in a sense, that happened at that time. So this book was just my place for that, right? So that's why the title is I Made a Place for You. And poetry for me has just been, it's like I love rap too. I make music as well. But both forms, I think that the thing that's super striking to me is you can code a message, right? So it's like it's almost like a hidden language. So you can read the words one way, but the way that they're arranged, can impact how that message hits. And I've always loved that. So that's why if you look at my book, the poems they're shaped, right? And the shapes are in a sense symmetrical to the illustrations, for a reason, because there's a visual component. And like, I haven't found anything else that makes me feel the sense of completion and satisfaction that I have from writing poems.
When you made the book, I Made a Place for You, tell the audience your experience. Were you self-published? Did you go with a publisher? What was that process like? And was it your very first time releasing your own book?
For sure. Yeah. So I actually published through an independent press. So indie presses are smaller than like your traditional like Penguin Books or something like that. But they operate like agencies in a sense where they help you with your cover designs, and they help you with structuring your book and like making sure all the formatting is correct and submitting everything in the proper documents to the printers and all those things. And so for me, it was essential that I felt I had put so much work and time and effort into this project that I needed to also invest in it so that I could make sure that my final product matched the intentions I had and vision for the project. So for me, self-publishing was never really an option, just because I knew that with my, lack of experience publishing, this is my first book, right? With my lack of experience, that kind of trying to get this illustrated poetry collection formatted properly, everything done the perfect way so that I could, send it out to editors for review and things like that. I needed to have the right team around to make sure that I did that. So I worked with an indie press, and it was great. I mean, I had strategy calls with them every month or every couple months, and they just tap you into different resources. I found out about Podmatch through the press, right? So like that was they were the reason why I even found out about the platform to start reaching out to podcasters, which is something I've been wanting to do for a while. So I think that like the ancillary benefits also were just great. Just like being in the right rooms and conversations to get the information you need are vital. And I think sometimes more important than whether you're going to save a buck or not. Right. So like I would have saved money by publishing myself, but there's so much that was not in those contracts or any of the agreements that I gained from working with the press, that the money part starts to just seem minimal at a point. You just realize that like, no, you need to be around this level of talent, this level of caliber of professionals. And like, that's what it's really about. It's really about like making yourself, iron sharpening iron, and you have to put yourself in the fire with these people. And so for me, it was great. It made me feel like I was taking myself to another level. It pushed me in different ways. And I also got to see my book come out the right way. So now I know what to expect for the future.
Once again, talking to our guest today, Damian, and your book, I made a place where you can get on Barnes and Noble and Amazon. When you see the result of just working hard, making it happen, and you took the necessary steps to accomplish your goals, what has it been like for you now that you have a published book? Have you been able to, how authors, they will go to events and promote it and, meet the readers? Have you been able to experience that after you published your first book?
So I did have a book launch for my book on November 1st, and it was amazing. I held it at an art gallery. I had, 60 people there, I'd say, and it was a great time. There was an art installation at the gallery during the launch period, so I benefited from that because the colors and the art matched up perfectly with the colors in my book cover. So that was great. I read a poem, not from the book that night. I signed a bunch of books. I got to just talk to people and answer questions. That's the only event I've done so far. Since the book has come out, I've been mostly focused on just like digital marketing and now getting on as many podcasts and the right podcasts as possible so that I can just share the message with people who are sharing it with people who want to hear, which is part of, I want to tell you this too. I really like the title of your podcast because it's one thing to be focused and it's a completely different thing to refocus. And I think that refocusing requires admitting flaws and looking for places you went wrong the first time or times you thought you had it all together. So I think that for me, developing that type of self-accountability system is essential for getting across the finish line. And in my opinion, like that's been the key to my success, or at least my feeling of satisfaction and success with where I am right now. So the title of your podcast has really resonated with my own outlook on life. And I wanted to tell you that. No,
I appreciate that, man. And when I listened to everything you're saying with your story, it's so interesting because you mentioned that you doing pretty good in school, doing really good in school, and things were going well. And then, things got a little shaky. You found yourself, in a situation where you're homeless, but you make all these steps, like everything from your grandma being able to help you get back home. But in order for you to get back to Ohio, you mentioned that bus ride, I think you said 25 hours plus or whatever. It was a very uncomfortable way to get back home. And I found that very interesting because I feel like sometimes, people getting back home, so to speak, back to that focus, quote unquote, mindset is totally uncomfortable. It's not easy. And when you see that, how much more do you appreciate that part of your journey to where now you have that experience of knowing that getting something that is valuable is not always going to be comfortable?
I mean, you put that perfectly. I would say that, for a long time, coming back home felt like when you're, dragging one of those like little red wagons, felt like but you're in it. Like that's how it felt. Like, I felt like I was in the wagon being pulled around. Like you're not in control of where you're going. You're just kind of like watching the world go around you, and you're just going where it goes, because I had lost my sense of self in a lot of ways. I didn't have like the clout anymore to say like, hey, I'm an adult out here adulting, got a good job, doing all the things, got my own place. And like I couldn't say that. I was staying at my mom's house for a period of time, so like I was renting my mom's car for a period of time, right? So those kind of things, like those are difficult to accept when you build your identity on the antithesis of that, on escaping all that. So like when I was 18 years old, there was nothing I wanted more than to be away from home and to be independent and to be autonomous. And then you have to kind of face the facts. I had to face the facts in a sense where all of that stuff was gone. So who are you now? Right? Who are you now? How do you want to present yourself now? How do you want to rebuild yourself now? What do you refocus on now? Right. And so for me, it was getting back to some sort of stable routine and putting my efforts back into things that always made me happy. So writing was one of those, writing was one of those things. Also just being around my family more. So I've lived away from my family for 4 years of college. And then I kept finding ways to be away from my family, and not have to come back to Ohio for the next few years after college too. So I think coming back home just reminded me like, hey, you had 18 years in this cocoon with these people who care about you and love you. And then, in your teenage years, you got mad and wanted to separate like every teenager wants to do. But that doesn't mean that you have to spend the rest of your life trying to push home further and further away, right? Especially when home's not trying to do that to you. Home's trying to pull you in and you're saying, hey, like, I know you're there, but I don't want any parts of that. And so I think that like now it comes full circle to the point where I can appreciate the fact that like the people who are still here were there even when I was paying them no mind.
Man, yeah, that's real stuff right there. Once again, listen, I Refocus Radio talking to Damian White, author of I Made Place for You. Yeah, man, I mean, I almost let you just preach on this show, man, because you're doing a good job. But when people listen to this, right, they're like, wow, like, if he can do it, man, I ain't got no excuses. So when it comes to mindset and your mental health, you're doing your thing. You have a book, you're doing other things, you're now on shows talking about your life and also promoting your book. How has your mental health been since experience being homeless? Do you find yourself still battling some things? Are you finding support systems to keep you away from those thoughts? Touch on that for the
I'm happy you asked that. I would say I'm in that best mental state that I've been in a long time, honestly. And I think that part of the reason why I was ready to come to podcasts and different platforms to tell my story had to do with the fact that I felt like my mental health was stable and that I had come to reconcile all the things that caused me agony in the past. And I'd had all the tough conversations I didn't want to have and that I'd buried inside. And I'd talked to the family members I didn't want to talk to in a while, and I'd hashed that stuff out. And I think that going through the hard stuff, like the actual work of mental health, sometimes there's one thing to figure out like, hey, I have anxiety. And, sometimes when I'm around X person or this person, like my anxiety flares up. And so it's one thing to be like, okay, I just can't be around that person. But it's another thing to say that is not a solution, because now this person's in control of my mental health in all of the scenarios where they're there. Right. And so you have to figure out like, how do I pull the reins in on that? So for me, I just feel like I've got to a point where like I make decisions out of stillness, and I feel like my mental clarity is good, and I keep as much chaos and stress out of my life as possible. So that way I can just move throughout life feeling confident and like not like I'm making decisions with my back against the wall.
Man, that's awesome. And what will you say to the audience who hear this and maybe they themselves or someone they know might be dealing with, some mental health issues? And want to make a disclaimer here: if you really are, or you know someone and you need professional help, definitely go see that. I'm not trying to, take away from what they do professionally, but just for the point of view of you personally experiencing that, what would you say to encourage someone that might be dealing with some mental health issues?
I would say allow yourself the full gamut of emotions. right? So it's okay to be sad, and it's okay to be depressed, and it's okay to be happy, and it's okay to be, unsure how you feel. And all of those are okay. And I think that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. And oftentimes, I had to have this conversation with my mom. I said, when I've gone through mental health crises myself, not just issues, crises. And I've told my mom in the past, hey, like I appreciate the help, but sometimes the goal isn't for everybody to feel better, right? Your goal, right now, the goal isn't to feel better. Sometimes you have to sit and think. Sometimes you have to really sit in the feelings and really understand what you're going through, because that emotional response that you have is not there for no reason. And it's not some test that like we have to go through, like this, your heart hurts and now your job is to figure out how fast you can heal it. That was never the intention of emotions. So for me, when I feel like a tug of war in my heart, or I feel unsure about something, or I start to feel a little bit of guilt and regret, I sit there and I think about it, and I stew in it and I ruminate, and then I come to a resolution. And like that process is going to be different for everybody. But for me, it's like you have to do that. And that's so much more beneficial, in my opinion, than allowing ourselves to sit and dwell in regret, to just recount the sad stories, and to not know what to do with all the pain and trauma. And like I have an issue, like now, just in general, when I'm around groups of people and you sit at a table and you hear sad story one, then the next person jumps to sad story two, then the next person jumps to the other thing that's really going bad in their life. And like I think there's a time and a place for that, but like I find that too many conversations sound like that. And the reason why I wanted to do podcasts at this point was because I knew that my perspective wasn't going to be that way, because I feel like I've come out on the other side of it. And I'm not talking from a place of someone who never went through it. I'm saying, no, I went through it. And now I'm at the place where I'm looking back saying like, hey, that's still not the end. Like that's not where it stops. And if you keep going a little further, then you're going to realize that like you don't want or need that type of negativity around you. And that's, to me, I'm the only one that knows what it looks like when I get to my lowest point of mental health. So I have to be the one that protects that. I have to be the one that draws the boundaries and says, hey, like, even if whatever I'm doing or saying or asking for is unpopular right now, like, I need you to know that I have this boundary where I can't go past that, because what happens, I don't like the person that I become. And so my number one priority at all time, I even told my wife this, like my number one priority still has to be making sure that I'm whole, because even if I allow myself to get to the point where I break down again, then I can't even be a good husband. I can't be a good son. I can't be a good stepdad. I can't be a good anything, because I'm not bringing my best self to any of those scenarios.
Once again, listen to I'm Refocused Radio, talking to our guest, Damian White. You can go to his website, DamianWhiteWrites.com. And also you can get his book on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, I Made a Place for You. Man, before we let you go, what would you like to share with our audience, and also a call to action?
Sure. Yeah. I would just like to say, don't hesitate when you get that spark of or fit of genius that you get sometimes in the morning or late at night or whatever. For me, like, it's a small example, but if I get an idea in the morning, like while I'm taking a shower, I immediately grab my pen and my paper and I write it down and just save it. I feel like those ideas are gifts, and a lot of times those gifts are meant to be used with our talents. And that link between those two is the work that we have to do. So I would say just try to make sure that you're being the bridge builder for those two things. And I've found that when I do that, and when I'm focused, and then when I'm not saying, hey, I can do that later and procrastinating, that the results are just coming naturally. So that would be my advice.
Man, once again, Damian White, make sure you get his book, I Made a Place for You. And what a story, man. I mean, from doing great to, having a shaky, season. But then look at you now. You're on the other side telling your story on different platforms. And hopefully this book can go viral. Hopefully people will hear this show and and you on other shows, and they go support this book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, man. I want to say thank you again for taking time in your schedule, talking to I Am Refocused Radio.
No, thank you for having me.
Hey, it's Shemai Reed with I Am Refocused Radio. Make sure you go to IamRefocusedRadio.com to listen to today's episode. Once again, like we always say, keep God first, stay focused, and peace.